Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to Madison's Notes. We are the official podcast of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, and I'm your host, Laura Laurent. This week, we are discussing institutional corruption in the news media with Professor Bill English, who is Assistant Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at Georgetown's School of Business. He's got his PhD in political science from Duke University, where he focused on ethical persuasion. He then spent 5 years at Harvard University, where he researched empirical and normative investigations of institutional corruption. Today, specifically, we're going to discuss the causes for declining trust in the news media as an institution and compare it to other public institutions with falling rates of trust. We discuss how news media has supported or hindered civic involvement and education since the American founding, as well as reflect on some of the limitations that news media possesses. Finally, Professor English is going to provide us with what he thinks are the reasonable solutions to the challenges news media is facing. So thanks for tuning in, and let's get on with the show. Well, Professor English, welcome to Madison's Notes. Thanks for coming on today's show.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, I was quite disappointed. I was unable to attend the lecture that you gave at Princeton University a few weeks ago on the institutional corruption of news media. In terms of looking at the overview of the lecture, I was really intrigued. And so I'm excited to get to share some of that conversation with our listeners here today. But before we get into the meat of the conversation, your background spans political economy and ethics and policy evaluation. And I'm curious what initially drew you to the intersection of these topics, but specifically media, trust, and democratic institutions.
Yeah, well, there's a lot that I think falls under the umbrella of politics. So, Aristotle, famously called it the master science because it has to sort of order and think about all areas of human affairs. And I do think political science, government politics remains kind of one of the most interesting disciplines in the academy today, because you'll have people in government departments that are doing, cutting edge statistics. You'll have people who are reading Aristotle and Plato, the history of political thought, people studying international relations, the history of treaties. There's so much that is within the discipline. And it is a challenge, I think, to have sufficient sort of methodological training to be able to integrate it all. And that's always been sort of an interest of mine. I was a math major as an undergrad and econ major. Spent a lot of my master's and graduate work more in political philosophy, political theory, and very interested in being able to talk across different concerns that come up, in social thought, particularly, empirical and theoretical and normative. So this I think invitation, and I mentioned this at the opening of my lecture, and by the way, thank you for mentioning that. So if people want a polished version of this talk, you can go to the Madison Program's recording of the formal lecture. And I think today we're going to kind of delve in deep and kind of follow questions wherever they go. But, as I mentioned in the opening of that talk, I had spent 5 years at Harvard's Ethics Center on a project that was, on the theme of institutional corruption. We had the so-called Lab on Institutional Corruption, a wonderfully interdisciplinary group of scholars there, all dealing with this question of how important institutions had strayed from the normative ends that legitimated them. So this took shape sort of in the shadow of the financial crisis of 2008, where you had banks that clearly misunderstood the risk that they were accumulating on their balance sheets. You also had apparently failures in rating agencies, failures in regulations. But as you kind of looked across society, there was all these other important institutions in medicine, in all sorts of regulatory challenges. And we had all these scholars kind of looking at different industries, trying to understand what went wrong. And one of the interesting features of this research project is we also had journalists. So we had an investigative journalism fellowship that was part of it, and had some great journalists over the years. I think at least one of them was part of a Pulitzer Prize winning investigation. And, the importance of journalism, I thought, was pretty clear. They're the ones that dig into the details and try to bring information to the public. And at one point, I was asked to write a sort of political theory overview of the project, at a 1,000-foot level. And I remember I wrote something very flowery about and very, I think, optimistic about journalism. And I'll just read you a quick excerpt here. So I had written, even the best convictions cannot be politically efficacious unless citizens have access to information that allows them to evaluate what's going on and to mobilize a response. The promise of democracy lies in this sort of oversight, but it depends on knowledge that's not easy to come by and which will be intentionally obfuscated by those who are exploiting the system. This is why it's no exaggeration to describe the press as a fourth branch of government in modern democracies. The press and related forms of media are what keep the government in check by documenting abuses of power and exposing corrupt bargains. Investigative journalism, in particular, connects the dots between the seen and the unseen in the halls of power, alerting citizens to crooked dealings and dysfunctional institutions, thereby provoking outrage and reform. So I think that's a sort of classic, I think, view of the importance of a free press to democracy. They're going to give citizens the information they need to hold, elected representatives accountable. Now, one thing, though, I sort of was reflecting on a few years later, and this is partially because I was on the receiving end of some journalism, is the one institution we did examine was journalism itself. And so there is this question, if journalism at its best can play this important role in democracies, what if it gets corrupted? To just take a sort of social science hat on this right now, it's astounding when you look at polls that ask people about different institutions and which institutions they trust. I think the evidence is pretty clear that journalism, mass media, is the one institution that has experienced the greatest decline in trust over the last half century. That's, I think, the sort of starting point for my interest in this project, is to understand what's happened in journalism that has resulted in this extraordinary decline in trust, and then what, if anything, can be done about it. And of course, this has been a big topic for the last few years, but I think there's some aspects of the academic literature has sort of misunderstood and gotten wrong. And I think there's also some really interesting technological things on the horizon that might offer some promising ways forward.
So first of all, for our listeners, if you do want the polished version of the lecture, you'll be able to find that on our website. The talk also has video, and you'll be able to see the actual numbers and graphs that were included in your lecture. So something I really appreciated about at least looking at the lecture slides before this conversation was, and your background is looking at how much you engage with numbers, in that I tend to work in a more political theory realm, and numerical analysis is also really important. So I just appreciate that you're able to talk between the two sides of this discipline to come up with hopefully something interesting for our listeners to think about. As far as the media being its own institution, this fourth branch, we haven't put the magnifying glass to. How did we get to the point where trust is so low? Like, what is the root of this distrust?
Yeah, and so this is really interesting because, one way to think about all these survey measures of trust is just at an absolute scale. And I should, just say the absolute lowest institution in terms of trust in America is Congress. So there, it's, if you look at the absolute scales, there are other institutions that rank worse than journalism, slightly worse. Now, there are some paradoxes here. Everyone says they distrust Congress, but they trust their congressman or congresswoman. So there, in surveys, there's always sort of, you want to understand the questions being asked. But I think what's interesting about the surveys on journalism and mass media is the comparative decline. So Americans have always sort of looked with suspicion towards Congress. So although it's declined some, it hasn't declined nearly as much as trust in the media over the last half century. And I've looked at Gallup, Pew, a number of other surveys. I do think I'm on firm ground here in saying that although there's been a secular decline in many institutions, it is media that's seen the biggest comparative decline. So that raises an interesting question. What's going on there that's worse than what's going on in all these other institutions? And one way to also think about that puzzle is, it's not obvious that there was ever a golden age where the media was perfect. And I'll share in a little bit some quotes from the founding fathers that reflected very deeply, but also very practically on questions of the freedom of the press and the media's role in democracy. So it's not that there was a golden age, but clearly I think something has changed. And so there's this sort of comparative questions: what has changed? And talking a little bit, because I think the academic literature, although it's identified, I think a number of dynamics that have probably contributed to this, is missing maybe some of the deepest dynamics. And this goes back to this question of institutional corruption. The animating idea behind this notion of so-called institutional corruption is it's not traditional corruption where there's clear bribery going on, or there's a clear quid pro quo where some actor, some say journalist says, I'm going to throw my ethics out the window for a big cash payment. The challenge of institutional corruption is often that it's much more subtle. It's something that gets into the way an institution functions, brings it down a slippery slope to the point that there's not necessarily something obviously illegal, something obviously unethical, but you get this weird equilibrium where the institution stops functioning. And there might be conflicts of interest that rise up and sort of get aggregated out into bad outcomes. But I think the subtleness of how journalism has sort of gone off the tracks is part of the equation here, and why some of the traditional remedies that are have been proposed, and we can talk about those in a second, really don't get to the heart of the matter. So it's this comparative question: what has changed? Where have we been, and where are we now, and what might be the most promising ways to improve trust in media going forward?
hmm When you say there hasn't been a golden age in American journalism per se, but we also are seeing this significant decline, I'd love to get more into exactly what we are distrusting the media about. Is it about that we don't expect them to do serious work, or that we feel like they're giving us a one-sided view?
The academic literature on this, and they actually have some colleagues at Georgetown, Ladd and Podkol, who have written extensively on this. They typically have identified sort of 4 reasons for loss of trust in media, or 4 mechanisms. So one of their theories is that the media content itself has changed towards a more, say, sensational tabloid style. And also in coverage of politics, a more cynical framing of everything's a game. And I think they have some good case studies on this, and they show how this arguably has been a trend in the last 20 or 30 years. There's probably also some financial incentives behind that. You need to get as many eyes as you can on your media products, and the more tabloid style it is, the more interest you might gin up on that. So that's one thesis. It's the type of content itself in the framing that the media employs that turns people off. A second thesis in the academic literature is that the journalistic process itself has become corrupted. So you have inaccuracies and biases in the media, that these get exposed. And once you have a record of a lot of corrections, or a lot of journalists caught saying things that were dishonest, not 100% true, that this record starts to create concerns about the journalistic process. And I think that's it's a promising insight that is somewhat undeveloped in the academic literature. It's of course there's always going to be inaccuracies and biases, but I think that's the tip of an iceberg that goes actually very deep. The third, I think, thesis out there, and this is something that Ladd is particularly, I think, fond of, is that the political context has changed, and in fact, you've had increasing partisan attacks on the media. So his argument is, the more that political actors see the media as their opponent, the more they're going to try to cast aspersions on the media, question its authority. And and that argument is it's precisely as a strategy to discredit the media that politicians use that has caused people to think that, we shouldn't distrust the media. But the sort of metacritique here is that this is as it were, let's say, strategic and disingenuous critique. It's not deserved, but it's a kind of manipulation or rhetoric that's led people to distrust when they shouldn't. And then the fourth, which again, this is, I think, the tip of a very deep iceberg, is changes in the modes of media consumption. So you have the proliferation of social media, digital technologies, and just to flesh this out, I think in some ways the obvious answer as to what's been the biggest change in journalism over the last half century is digital technologies. And part of why I think this is so important, and we talked about the golden age, it's important to understand that almost from the time of the printing press to the 1980s, there's a kind of quasi-monopoly, or say oligopoly, in the media. So you could buy a printing press, but to actually have a successful newspaper, it's pretty high capital expenditures. You need a lot of ink, you need a lot of paper, you need it on a daily basis, you need distribution networks. And fast forward to radio, well, there's only so much bandwidth out there, and the government's going to, allot that off. Same with broadcast TV. Media has always been somewhat concentrated, and I think there's always a question of when you're in a kind of quasi-monopolist mode, it's easier for people to maybe trust you because they don't have as much alternatives to critique. So undoubtedly the proliferation of digital technologies over the last few decades has created many competitors to the traditional kind of monopolies. But it also, and this is also really important, it also completely undid the revenue model for traditional media, which was advertising. So again, you even going back to the printing press. You start a paper. You're able to get enough capital to start, printing it, distributing it on a daily basis. You get enough readership out there. That's all something because of the daily cost to print and to get the paper out, and your margins aren't great. Where you start to make money is if you actually create enough of an audience out there that's reading your stuff on a daily or weekly basis. Now you can sell advertisement, and you have essentially all these eyes that are going to be looking at your pages, and that becomes the space on the pages all of a sudden becomes really valuable once you have those network effects. So historically, this is true in newspaper, it's true in radio, it's true in television. The sort of flip side of the quasi-monopolies is once they're established, once you have network effects, you have this tremendous capacity to generate ad revenue. Because again, there's very other things that's going to get in front of people's eyes on a daily basis in the same way. And of course, the internet also totally disintermediates that. So you can get targeted advertising now. You have a total collapse of traditional modes of newspaper advertising, to some degree also at least much more competitive environment for television advertising. So there's all this disruption that's happened over the last few decades, which I think is not surprising that this is when the period of trust goes down. You have, on the one hand, intense pressure by media companies to grow and also keep audiences. And so that partially explains, why you get more sensationalist reporting, clickbait news, and that sort of thing. But you also have this scramble, to find new economic models. And so there's a lot going on. I think in some ways the golden age was perhaps more of a function of, a period of quasi-monopolies, but also a period in which, think about the 1950s and 1960s in America. You have the boomer period. You have a lot of economic growth. You have, a somewhat charmed period despite the Cold War and all the angst over that, where, there's only a handful of really routes to disseminate information. And for reasons I can talk about a little bit later, there's also an intense government interest in, keeping those handful of quasi-monopolies within certain bounds. And that's often going to be like a hidden, not obvious to, I think, the outside viewer. But yes, in terms of what's changed, I think technology is probably the big change. And what that has introduced is not only economic competition, but also competition in terms of alternative narratives, alternative perspectives. And then finally, and this is, just to make the point, this may be obvious, but a lot of what the news used to do was report. That is, there was an accident last night. Well, that's something you can, anybody who was there can take a picture and put a video now on social media. And if there's an interaction with police, we have body cameras now. You can go see it and judge for yourself. If a politician makes a speech, you can print the speech, you can watch it live, you can watch it the next day in your pajamas in bed. So we now have unmediated access to all these primary sources that technology has made available, and it becomes much more evident if the news is lying to you. If your own two eyes say, hey, I just watched that speech, and the way you've spun it is, inaccurate or dishonest in some ways. So in some ways, I think it's not totally mysterious that trust has gone down in the midst of all this upheaval. And then, but we can talk about this in a second here. I think the news has always been a sort of full contact sport. And this is something that even the founders recognize. And so it's not that we're dealing with unprecedented new issues in the news, but it's a question of how I think the competitive landscape has changed and what sort of challenges that creates and what sort of opportunities might help us deal with those challenges.
Yeah, and as you say, there wasn't necessarily a golden age. The way that I'm seeing it is the golden age was just the problems we were used to having. Like we were used to these limitations that limited who was taking on the massive amount of the scale to print or to broadcast or whatever. And as access has become easier, it's like maybe we're solving some problems that we were having before, but obviously we're generating new problems for ourselves. So, but it almost gives me hope to see it as that of like, oh, we didn't have a golden age. It was just different problems. And now we have new problems, in that these are our new problems and we can address them as other problems were addressed in the past. One more thing I want to ask, and I want to pull in a quote that you included in your presentation and is from our namesake, James Madison. He was writing a letter to W.T. Barry in August of 1822. And he said, a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. That's very striking. And I'm curious from your perspective and your studies and all the time you've put into this work, do you get the sense that the founders foresaw this kind of media fragmentation that we're seeing today, or the manipulation that we're seeing within the public sphere? Do you think they would have said something different if they knew what was coming later?
Great question. Yes. And I love this. It's a beautiful quote from James Madison that expresses what I think is a very common sentiment you'll find amongst all the founders, which is at the level of theory, at the level of high political theory. They recognize the press is going to be so important for democracies to function. You need citizens who are informed, and you need to have them capable of getting access to knowledge. They all recognize this. We have these extraordinary First Amendment, freedom of the press enshrined in the Constitution. So that's the high theory. But the founding fathers were also practical men. They were men of politics. Men who governed in the early republic, and they have to deal with the press as a reality as well. And so you see, it's amazing in some of the correspondence of this era. I think they have an exquisite appreciation of both the importance of the press in theory and the challenges of the press's actual execution of their job in practice. So just to kind of set up the duality here in the opposition. This is, Thomas Jefferson had this famous letter to Charles Yancey. He's writing in 1816, where Jefferson says, this is a quote, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. The functionaries of every government have propensities to command at will the liberty and prosperity of their constituents. There is no safe deposit for these, but with the people themselves, nor can they be safe with them without information. Where the press is free and every man able to read, all is safe." So again, that's the high theory. As long as you have a free press, as long as people can access it, they can read, all is going to be safe in a democracy. Now, contrast this with Jefferson's, I think, dealings with the press, where he has to go through the slings of the mudslinging of the press and actually wrestle with how to think about its operations and practice. So there's this incredible correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and a young man named John Norvell. So John Norvell is 18 years old. He lives in Kentucky, and he writes Jefferson in 1807 while Jefferson's the sitting president of the United States. So this 18-year-old's writing Jefferson, and the letter, most of the letter is Norvell asking for Jefferson's reading recommendations. Oh, and by the way, in the last paragraph of this letter, the young Norvell says, "Also, I'm curious if you have any advice for how newspapers should be run, because someday I wish to run one myself." So Jefferson, he writes him back, and he begins the letter with a bunch of reading recommendations. And then Jefferson turns to this issue of the press, which again, it was just like 2 or 3 sentences at the end of Norwell's letter. And this touches a nerve in Jefferson, and it becomes the subject of the bulk of his letter. So this is what he says. He says, "To your request of my opinion of the matter in which a newspaper should be conducted so as to be most useful, I should answer by restraining it to true facts and sound principles only. Yet I fear such a paper would find few subscribers. It's a melancholy truth that a suppression of the press could not more completely deprive the nation of its benefits than is done by its abandoned prostitution to falsehood. So he's saying, banning the press might do less damage than what the press is doing itself by prostituting itself to falsehood all over the place. So he goes on. This is Jefferson, quote, and I quote, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. The real extent of this state of misinformation is known only to those who are in situations to confront facts with their knowledge within their knowledge with the lies of the day. I really look with commiseration over the great body of my fellow citizens who, reading newspapers, live and die in the belief that they have known something of what has been passing in the world in their time. I will add that the man who never looks into a newspaper is better informed than he who reads them, inasmuch as he who knows nothing is nearer to the truth than he whose mind is filled with falsehoods and errors." End quote. Okay, so this is Jefferson with the sort of reality of the press. You can't believe anything in newspapers. They're full of misinformation. You're better off not reading them than thinking you know stuff based on the errors and falsehoods that they present. Okay, so that's the sort of practical challenge, which is, I think, a perennial challenge in human affairs. It's funny because this young man, Jonathan Norvell, does actually go on to be a co-founder of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and later actually becomes a senator from Michigan. So he takes hopefully some of Jefferson's advice when he founds the Philadelphia Inquirer. But I think the challenge that Jefferson identifies is sort of this perennial challenge of how do you deal with newspapers being the mediators of human conflict, knowing that there are no sort of neutral or impartial mediators. So and to put this in the frame of Federalist Papers, famously, Madison writes, no man should be the judge in his own case. Yet what is democracy? But us the people having to be judges. So this whole challenge is recapitulated in the nature of the news. Again, this is just a few more riffs on Jefferson here, because I think Jefferson understood the problem, but his mature thought on this, I think, is probably the right view, which I think we still embrace today, which is, yes, newspapers, media can, traffic in all sorts of perversions of truth and justice. And yet, they still contribute to our public discourse in ways that are essential. So essential that it would be much worse to limit the press. And our duty is to put up with its lacerations and its slanders. And the idea being that in the context of all this, you might say politicking in the press, still the truth is something that can make an impression on democratic peoples and ultimately triumph. And I'll return at the end to, I think, maybe Jefferson's most profound insight into this process. But again, this is to say, look, there's nothing new here in terms of people having trust issues with the news. That goes back a long time. However, we did have this period in the country 50 years ago where, we have fairly concentrated news media. We've had all sorts of, economic and technological change that's led to enormous distrust. And, to get back to the academic literature on this, my worry is that a lot of academics are looking for mechanisms here while ignoring with the sort of obvious elephant in the room, which is that, the reason people distrust news media is because it's conducted itself in untrustworthy ways, and that it's easier to notice this. So, partially for technological reasons that we've talked about earlier. So, why has there been a decline in trust? Well, because it's deserved. Historically, there's been a partisan divide in this. So the Republican voters distrust the media more, and that has, accelerated in recent decades. However, I think one of the most striking discoveries in recent surveys is that amongst the youngest cohort, so your 18 to 29-year-olds, their distrust in the media, even amongst Democrats, is basically on par with young Republicans. So it has now, in the youngest cohorts, the partisan divide has more or less disappeared. I mean, there's a few perturbations in different elections and whatnot. But amongst younger people, it's almost universal, their distrust of the media. So that's where we're headed. That's the future. And it's not only right-wing critiques, right? So there's plenty of left-coded critiques of news media on this issue of reasons to distrust them. Certainly, one of the major themes is that news has been corrupted by financial interests. Billionaires have these platforms they use for their own purposes. There's clickbait. They have to appease advertisers. And of course, one of the major themes, I think the left-coded themes over the last, say, 8 years has been this question of disinformation, wanting to have fact checkers, wanting to have, police misinformation, disinformation on the internet. Sort of more right-coded view of it. The right people talk about fake news. They talk about biased news. There's also a concern about government censorship that came out in some recent court cases. So, we're in this moment where I think people rightly have noticed that the, news media has, maybe not intentionally, but it's become awfully corrupted in terms of some basic standards of honesty and trustworthiness. So then the question is, so what do you do about that?
Yeah, well, and I think another point that I'm really curious about, at least as far as where we are, is this intelligibility between news sources. I can see that left and right leaning individuals are at this point in the younger generation, you say they're on par with distrust for the media. And within my line of work, I try to read across lots of different news sources. And it just seems like people are speaking completely different languages. And not just different languages, what's really different is the stories, baseline assumptions about the stories that they're telling them. And this sort of incapacity to not just have a newspaper that is numbers and facts that wouldn't sell. Like, you do have to tell some kind of story. And the stories are so vastly different. And I know that you have studied and referenced Alistair McIntyre, who's one of my personal favorites. And his work on narration, I think, is really pertinent to this. But with at least McIntyre's idea of rival traditions becoming unintelligible to one another, like, are we in that moment? And if so, is it a longstanding part of human nature? Is it that we've always existed like this, and so now it's just becoming more clear that this is almost at our nature, as opposed to this being a nature of news media? Or is this something that's being activated by the medium itself?
Right. Yeah, no, this is a great question. And this gets to the heart of, I think, two different visions for what to do about distrust in the media. And the one vision, I'm going to invoke two media superstars to sort of map this out. So the first is Bill Adair, who won the Pulitzer Prize in 2009. And he's the founder of PolitiFact, which is one of these fact-checking websites. And he's been involved in a lot of other fact-checking technologies. I think recently he was the director of the DeWitt Wallace Center at Duke for journalism. And, he made this statement in a Pulitzer Prize discussion of why so many Americans distrust the media. He said the following, quote, "We have to recognize that we live in such a chaotic information age. People need trusted brokers to help them figure out what's true and what's not," end quote. So that is what I'm going to call, I think that's the main answer given by many traditional media outlets, that what we have now is this chaotic ecosystem. Anybody can post anything. Social media can have anything go viral. And what's needed are trusted brokers. And sort of I think reinforcing this vision was a famous comment by Ben Bradley, who was the former editor of the Washington Post, where he said, quote, "The credibility of a newspaper is its most precious asset, and it depends almost entirely on the integrity of its reports," end quote. So again, there's this view of the most important thing big media outlets can have is integrity. To have integrity, they need to have integrity in their reports, in their reporting, in their reporters. And if we could just get back to a situation where we have a few trusted brokers of information, they can be the filter for us, tell us, based on their extraordinary integrity and responsibility, what's important, how to think about, matters of controversy, what's fake news, what's misinformation. I think that's one major vision that's emerged. And I think it's a mistake. You can see the attractiveness of it, but I think it's profoundly mistaken in terms of its capacity to actually help us in the present moment. If the kind of traditional news media's answer to distrust is, okay, we need a few trusted brokers, and as long as they act with integrity, we can people will notice that, and they can be the filters for us. I think the opposite, and in fact, the more promising is, let's say, rather than that centralized approach, the alternative is something like decentralization, open access, crowdsourced information. Social media is obviously, historically the mode for this, but it's actually changing dramatically. I think, month by month in terms of how stuff gets aggregated. And one way to think about this is, do you want authoritarian? And I use that word deliberately because it's based on authorities. Do we want a handful of authorities that are the filters for trusted news, or do we want a democratic ecosystem where anybody who has something worth noting can throw that observation, argument, documentation into the ring? And can we have ways of sort of discovering and promoting the most useful, important, insightful, truthful contributions in ways that aren't centralized, that don't require gatekeepers, fact checkers, and so on? So here's the problem, I think, with the few trusted brokers approach. And this gets to the sort of corruption angle, the institutional corruption angle, which again is often not deliberate, but subtle and corrosive over time. Anytime you have centralization in news dissemination or centralization in filtering, there's such an obvious and important value to propaganda and to censorship that it's going to be like a lightning rod for anybody who has political interests to control those through you might say through points. So obviously the government is going to have the biggest interest in this, and we saw there was a handful of court cases. One of them went before the Supreme Court, really asking this question about to what degree can government agents tell social media and news companies what to take down, what to censor. And we didn't get actually a good answer on that because the case was ultimately the Supreme Court said that there was a lack of standing. So we didn't get the full fleshed out theory of where precisely the bright lines are. But, so long as there are a handful of gatekeepers for information to the public, these are going to be extraordinarily gamed, strategically manipulated. There's going to be enormous efforts, government and otherwise, to recruit them into various causes, including censorship and propaganda. And the great theorist of this, who some people are probably familiar with listening to this, is the great Edward Bernays, who wrote a famous essay called "The Engineering of Consent." I highly recommend this essay. Beautiful. On the one hand, it's an essay that celebrates democracy, celebrates mass communication. But if you read it closely, Bernays, I think, makes fairly clear that there's an obligation those in government have to use communication infrastructure to guide the public to the policymaker's desired end. At one point in the essay, he says, quote, "This role naturally imposes upon them the obligation to use the educational process," by which he means all sorts of forms of mass media, "as well as other available techniques to bring about as complete an understanding as possible." And he talks about how, essentially, the engineer of consent must create news. News is an inanimate thing. He talks about, how you would actually go about creating news. And ultimately, he makes these fairly obvious observations that when the public is convinced of an idea, it's going to proceed to action. And so these results, he observes, don't just happen in a democracy. They can be accomplished by the engineering of consent. And his other work sort of really goes into detail. He's often considered both the father of advertising, but also father of modern propaganda, of how you can manipulate masses of people into believing certain things. And so just to get back to the larger thesis, so long as you have a few trusted brokers, so long as you have centralization in mediating what things the masses, can get access to in media, you're going to have an enormous concerted propaganda and censorship effort in those choke points. So that's one reason where I think there's going to be a natural corrupting of even the most, even if they have great integrity. We have some really good editors who are conscientious. They're going to face unbelievable pressure, and that's just the fact of centralization.
Well, and before we get into these solutionings, like what exactly is a protocol for our less tech saturated listener base?
Great question. Yes. So, at the most basic level, a protocol you can think of as a set of rules. And the nice thing about protocols is they're transparent. The rules are there. Once they're in place, people will be interacting according to some rule set that they don't control.
And it's like coded.
Yeah. So just to my my former boss, Larry Lessig, wrote a wonderful book called, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And in there, he made the famous sort of claim that code is law. So you can imagine a protocol is a sort of, you might think of as, it's a set of rules, a set of laws on how our interactions together are going to be governed. In this case, in the information space. And so given the nice thing is, now we could change the protocol. We could say, here's one protocol over here. I'm going to fork it. I'm going to change it. Facebook is going to use a different protocol with some changes from what Twitter uses. But once it's there, it's transparent. And the idea is that you no longer have individuals in there tipping the scales and saying, oh, these rules gave us an outcome I don't like. Let's not publish that. It's sort of once it's there, then we're all committed to the outcome. And again, the idea is that if the protocols are efficient, if they are generative and getting to the truth of things, getting to news that matters, that those sorts of rule sets are going to be really valuable. There's also a great essay if you're interested in this sort of concept by Balaji, who is one of these tech people who I think co-founded Coinbase, on what he calls protocol politics. I think there's I teach a class on data ethics and privacy, and there's I think this realization over the last decade that so much of our lives are digitally mediated today that this is a matter for national level statecraft concerns, like
almost at a civic level. It's like at this point, so much of our civic life lives in the internet that we actually need to be technologically savvy. We need to understand our data privacy. We need to understand what the laws are that are governing the space that we're trying to participate, and also thinking about the laws that are governing our government.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is the question: who actually rules in the technological age? If is it these large SaaS companies? Is it the social media companies? And I think the sort of decentralized vision for this is, you can imagine, just to break this down at a very intuitive level, like right now, if I want to call an Uber or a Lyft, I go to the company Uber. And, they're the ones that manage the whole ride sharing service. You could imagine there being a protocol out there. And what the protocol does is it allows anybody to plug into it. So I could broadcast, hey, here's my address right now. I want to ride to this location. I'm willing to pay this much. It goes out there to the protocol. Anybody out there, they don't have to be on Lyft or Uber, whatever, can come in and say, okay, I'm willing to take your ride. And by the way, here's my list of previous, let's say, ratings, and the ratings would have to have some way of establishing their credibility. You might also have some sort of, here's my government background check, proof of verification of that. But you could imagine this being done in a decentralized way, right? If there's a protocol that efficiently matches and aggregates information people need who are looking for rides and who want to offer rides, and even the security stuff could, with the right sort of oracles, with the right sort of background checks, be verified. You could imagine the company itself sort of withering away, and what you get is, you're like, oh yeah, I use that ride sharing protocol. And all it is, it's a set of code out there. And so long as we're both verified as interacting with the same code base, I think the interesting thing about protocols is sort of once they're devised, you get beyond the situation where somebody can meddle with outcomes they don't like. Now you can always change a protocol. It can develop and evolve and become better or worse. But you're going to see, I think, equilibria forming on really good protocols that enable, as you might say, actually the rule of law and not the rule of man, like the most purest form of the rule of law you can imagine.
Okay, so what is the solution that you see as more aligned with some of these democratic principles?
Yeah, I see the future as being a decentralized future, enabled by protocols that will increasingly do a good job of helping aggregate information, fact check information, but also put opposing views in dialogue with each other. So, and just to make clear, some of the other corrupting forces on media, there's a whole literature on this, and maybe it's not worth belaboring here, but there's certainly, explicit arguments for journalists being political actors. Ted Glasser at Stanford is, I think, probably one of the most famous people associated with this view. He was part of a larger movement in so-called public journalism. And, the idea here is that, journalists need to be, this is a quote from Glaser, journalists need to be overt and candid advocates for social justice. And it's hard to do that under the constraints of objectivity. So, Glazer and others are going to say journalists need to go out there. They should have a point of view. They should try to persuade the public of it. But this creates a challenge again with, do you want journalists who report or do you want journalists that advocate? And again, journalists who have integrity might say, look, my integrity requires me to be an advocate, which means they're going to be, presenting a view and trying to persuade you. But it's again kind of antithetical to that idea of, you think of journalists, are they more like Lady Justice that has a blinder on her eyes and is just trying to put out the evidence to be weighed? Or is it somebody who's out there as an advocate, sometimes not even letting you know they're an advocate, presenting things supposedly as objective that are really fairly deeply embedded with an argument?
I think we could call a lot of news sources as like they're actually more magazines in that they're telling me what happened maybe for 30 seconds or like a very small portion of whatever piece you're putting out. But really, you're still trying to push a narrative, which is fine. But let's just call it what it is instead of saying that these narrative tellings are the thing that happened.
Yeah, and Madison, on Faction, famously in Federalist 10, I think kind of called this dynamic. People have different interests. Journalists are people too; they have interests. But if they're going to be practicing democracy like the rest of us, we shouldn't view them as like these judges presenting evidence to us, but more as members of the jury along with us. And then that raises this question, sort of, Madison's solution for Faction was we needed a larger republic because we can get all the factions out there presenting their pieces, and it's less likely in a large republic that one faction is going to monopolize. Imagine you want to understand a hot button issue today, it's immigration. Would you rather have the New York Times summarize this in a single article, or would you rather say go and hear the strongest case made by different factions, by the Cato Institute, by the Center for Immigration Studies, by Brookings, by the Center for American Progress? I'm sure the New York Times piece will be really well written, but probably a lot of people aren't going to rely on it to give a fully, a full-throated defense of the different views out there, in which case you might want to go to the sources themselves, the different factions. So that's, again, a reason why I think even in an age of activist journalism, maybe which is inevitable if you take, people like Glazer seriously, it's going to be, centralization is not your friend. Decentralization is the way you deal with faction, by getting everyone's voice at the table.
Yeah, I mean, but that's also a huge labor on the reader's part where it's only because it's part of my job to read so many news articles or so many sources that I can actually do so. If I had a different job, I could say, oh, I know I need to do this, but I don't actually have the ability to do that given all my other constraints. So what are some of the protocols that you are seeing that would maybe help consolidate this effort for readers while still respecting their dignity in being able to discern the truth?
Exactly. And this I think will help wrap everything together here. So this is precisely the problem. You have 350 million people in America. You can't read all of their tweets every day. And so there's this question of what are ways to aggregate information that is important, and also ways to have different views put in dialogue with one another that would actually result in, say, efficient summaries of the most important things we should know and think about. And just to get back to the McIntyre point, McIntyre's concern is that human beings reason within what he calls traditions of thought and inquiry, and traditions can become unintelligible to one another. And I think we've all seen examples of this in politics, where one side sees something profoundly in this way, the other one sees it profoundly in a different way, and it's all, they just talk past each other, and it's not even clear you can fully understand exactly all the concerns of the other. And so McIntyre, I think, has very, very deep and insightful philosophical discussions of this, and Whose Justice, Which Rationality, and some of his other essays on this problem of incommensurability, but also the conditions under which rational engagement is possible, where people articulate within their own tradition questions they have. They see ways in which other traditions might provide resources that help them reason through their questions to the point where they realize, oh, that other tradition has something to offer me on my own terms, but that also means now I need to perhaps accept some of their premises. And so you have an evolution over time. And McIntyre's sort of model, or at least one model where he sees this happening, is in classically Thomas Aquinas, and particularly Thomas Aquinas's method, which is this sort of scholastic philosophical method called the disputatio. And, very briefly, this is the idea that you're going to, and you'll see it in the Summa Theologica sort of exemplified, where you essentially, state some question, you get summaries of the strongest arguments against that position. You then get summaries of authoritative sources that agree with the position. You then get the reasoner trying to adjudicate between them, taking both into consideration with a final sort of judgment. And then you get detailed responses to those counter arguments that were previously made to try to wrap this all up. I think you can consult McIntyre on ways in which this kind of works in practice and why it's philosophically productive. But what's interesting is I think that format of the sort of statement response, and sometimes it includes fact checking. This person said this. However, it turns out this is the case, and therefore, our premise is not true. That this, at least formally, looks like a lot of social media stuff, right? You can see like a wall of comments. Somebody states something. Somebody comes back with a retort that's actually pretty powerful. It gets upvoted, so it's the first one. Somebody said contra. However, have you thought of this? And or here's another, a piece of evidence you haven't considered. And so it's interesting, social media has this sort of, just at a formal level, the capacity to, fact check, respond, have debates, be open to other sides' commentary over time. And I think the $1 million question here is, are there ways in which that technology, that format can develop that will enable, and here's where protocols, I think, is the right way to think about this, enable productive exchange of ideas and fact checking at scale without the need for centralized censors. And the sort of, I think the best working example of this is the whole Twitter community notes protocol, which is constantly sort of being developed and updated. It predated Elon Musk, of course, and his acquisition of Twitter. And I briefly in the talk kind of go into some of the technical discussions of how it works. And a few people have written very, really excellent discussions of this. Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, has one particularly rich one. But the idea is that, what a protocol is doing is it's going to be some set of rules. And in this case, it's thousands of lines of Python code that is going to have a way for discriminating what are some of the most valuable pieces of either claims or information put on social media. And the key here is, how do you deal with partisanship? So you have people, at one end and people at the other. But if you have areas where both those sorts of people who historically disagree on a lot of things actually agree on this point, that's one signal that something is interesting going on here. And, Vitalik and others kind of break down what's going on in the model. One thing I think that is really interesting in how the Twitter protocol has evolved is he said, it's not this elegant algorithm that's fully fleshed out, that deals perfectly with all cases. It's not like an economist solution that would be this perfect closed form solution. It's much more of an engineer's solution, which is this was tried and then it got modified. And we have a way of tracking public mood. We have a way of tracking a note's helpfulness. We have a way of tracking polarity. And it turns out, as these have been knit together over time, this is getting us better and better, quality outputs that a lot of people could agree upon. And so community notes is not perfect. There's a type 1, type 2 error situation, problem going on here. But it really is a profoundly interesting decentralized way of being, of literally, crowdsourcing feedback in ways that surface, I think, highly accurate, valuable fact checks, as well as, productive discussions back and forth. And so, although not perfect, I think it signals probably the way forward, which is going to be, in particular, this is even more true with the way that AI is developed, and I think aggregators are going to develop, where you're going to see interoperability across essentially all social media, all media, period, where you're going to have probably not a few trusted intermediaries like the Washington Post, New York Times, but you're going to have trusted aggregators that prove to be really productive and generative over time in getting you high value information. And if information is power, there's going to be competition here that's actually, I think, fairly productive. It's not just a marketplace of ideas with a lot of information asymmetries and difficulty, but you're going to have more and more experimentation on ways of aggregating information that actually do correspond to things that large amounts of people find valuable.
Well, and I think something that's interesting about these types of protocols that are more community aggregated is they help users see the same things. In that I have had my own experiences where I'm looking at content and all the comments are of a particular vibe, and I send that video to a friend who has a different digital profile. And when you look at the comments from their account, they see completely different content. And so it's not just that we are telling different stories, it's that we are literally not seeing the same things. And so that's very hopeful for me. As far as where our listeners could potentially go to learn more about these types of responses, are there any that are operating outside the Twitter space that you would be able to recommend for our listeners to go and investigate so that as they pursue hygienic digital
Yes.
engagement, they can go and participate and be aware of these tools?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a great question. So one of the interesting things about the Twitter community notes algorithm is all open source. So you can go in and actually see what the code is doing if you want. And even with AI today, it can help you interpret the code. So even if you're not a tech person, and one of the big developments recently on this is Meta announced earlier this year that they're going to be adopting a version of community notes and getting rid of their fact checkers. And so they're going to tweak it. They're going to change the open source algorithm in ways that, again, will be transparent. What I think you're going to see is sort of more and more versions of this forking of, a version of community notes where different social media ecosystems try to optimize on, how can we make this, the best arbiter of trustworthy information. Uh, Now, the other big thing that's coming down the pipeline is it's more kind of decentralized technologies. I think you're going to have more and more kind of say personal server-based aggregation technologies. The one I know most is hyperware is I think launching pretty soon. Urbit was an earlier version of this. And you see, like even there's Blue Sky and Farcaster, Twitter alternatives. But there's always a question of like, well, who's going to be the server doing this? Is it going to be Twitter servers, Facebook servers? I think you're going to get more and more personal servers where people are going to say to their own AI agent, like, hey, I want to know in the morning what's the most important international news, what's the biggest medical advances for this ailment that I have, and what's my local news and the traffic report and the weather. And you're going to have very powerful ways of getting that information together in one place. And part of that is going to be competition on the kind of say community notes type protocols that are going to aggregate information. Now, it's not all going to be, one thing that protocols can do over time, and one thing that's going to, I think, emerge from this is also you're going to have new trusted news sources. They're going to be much more diverse. They might be all over the political spectrum, but, you're going to have, you have like the Free Press spins off from the New York Times because they want to have a less woke, version of, say, centrist liberalism. And they become a kind of trusted source for a former New York Times reader. You have all these blogs out there, Tyler Cowen and Marginal Revolution. I think for economists, whether wherever you are on the political spectrum, there's just really high quality content there. And so I think you're going to get more and more discovery of trusted individuals, trusted, news brokers, trusted aggregators, and also ways in which you get a lot of, crowdsourced feedback on these. That's not going to eliminate politics. It's not going to eliminate disagreement. It's not going to eliminate all forms of unintelligibility. But I think it's possible this can go towards an echo chamber route. I think actually it will turn out that's not actually that valuable. So if information is actually power, knowledge is power, you're going to want protocols, aggregators that are getting you true things that are useful. And so this might be, I think, in some sense, we might be approaching a time where the marketplace of ideas starts to work in a more efficient way than it's ever has historically, which could be really promising. I mean, to bring it back a little bit here, at the end of the day, there's this kind of question about democracy and about self-government and how's that going to work. And to get back to the outset, there is this idea people need to have information, and that's the lifeblood of a democracy. But we're going to have powerful, if you have have a few trusted sources of the brokers of information, there's the worry that they're going to be corrupted. So is there a way to have a, say, more authentically democratic form of the development of information where, citizen journalist or just anybody passing by takes a picture, makes an argument, uploads a video, you can see primary sources? Are there ways to aggregate those through protocols? We get information that is true, and we also get interactions that help check each other. Even potentially across different hermeneutic, different traditions of thought. That seems to be this is very close to the project of self-government and project of democracy. It's not just an issue of, the economics of news media, but it's how do you get people, in a democratic republic, participating in their self-government through both the sharing of information, but also the, learning from information. And, I thought, again, just to get back to Jefferson, the kind of the mature real world view of Jefferson's that comes out it's a draft letter from 1805 that I think is it's Jefferson totally understanding how dirty and messy politics is, how dirty and messy the media can be. I think this is Jefferson at his most realistic, but also most profound. It's not obvious. It's a real experiment. Can you have a free press that is going to trade in all sorts of falsehoods, malice, politicking? And at the end of the day, will the people themselves, who is the Constitution provides as the ultimate basis of authority, can they discern the underlying truth and act on it? And Jefferson's observation is that at least by 1805, even though he's in the middle of all the scrutinies and attacks by the press, that the people have actually risen to that occasion. And I think going forward, the sort of hope of decentralized technologies, protocols of news aggregation, disputation, really is the most democratic possibility for enabling knowledge to govern. And it's going to mean getting away from, essentially now is centuries of quasi-monopoly, oligopoly, pardon me. It's getting away from literally centuries of quasi-monopoly, oligopolies in media from a handful of trusted sources to a much more democratic state of affairs where anybody can make an argument, can put together data, can document something, can respond to somebody else's argument, and do so in a way that can be aggregated so that we can all benefit from that. So the experiment is still being tried. But I think with Jefferson, I'm optimistic that, quote, man may be trusted with the control of his own affairs.
Well, with that, thank you so much for coming on today's episode. And for our listeners, we've gone through a lot of things. And if you want more information, please go to our website and find the lecture with Professor English that will have more visuals about some of the analytics that he pulls in. But again, Bill, thank you so much for coming on today's episode of Madison's Notes.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me, and keep up the great work up there.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes. If you want more content like this, make sure to follow us on your favorite listening platform and find us on social media under the James Madison Program. Madison's Notes is researched, hosted, produced, edited, and engineered by me, Laura Laurent. And if you have comments or ideas for future guests or episodes, feel free to reach out to me through the James Madison Program social media. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week on Madison's Notes.